So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War, and it's actually possible I've already done a little something with J-Monster at the time that this video releases. We'll have to wait and see about that, but regardless of that, we have a bit of a 3v2 here, which is obviously going to be an attack-defense type situation. It is, technically speaking, a siege, although it has a similar air to it about that Thranduil's Halls battle that I showed that one time, where the defenders were actually on the opposite side to what they intended to be, and so they will now have to defend the outside of the settlement, though fortunately this is actually the settlement that I showed in the prisoner scenario that I did not too long ago. So as I get over my Vietnam style flashbacks about what happened in the comments section there, we'll be going on the same map today, interestingly enough. So we've got obviously the makeshift boats and the port town, but we won't be actually seeing much of the internal workings of the settlement on this occasion, because the defence is going to happen outside within the hills. Something else you may also notice that in the latest patch of Silmarillion, they made a bit of a change to the vegetation. So the trees and the like, I think they integrated a separate mod that's sort of a standalone thing from that someone made from Med 2, and they've put it into Silmarillion. And it definitely makes a bit of a difference, I have to say, a positive difference at that. It makes the vegetation look a little bit better, I would say. Like the standard trees in Medieval 2 are obviously a little bit strange, and there is still obviously the pop-in, but that's something you can't really avoid with Medieval 2. Sprites sort of change into actual units and the like. And today is actually the first time that I will be able to talk about the Easterlings. Now, my understanding of the Easterlings is somewhat limited, actually, because I didn't look into them in depth when I was doing the Finarfin reveal, because obviously they were a little bit afterwards. But we may as well go through the blue team first and foremost. They will be defending today, so it'll be sort of a break from the norm. We'll be going through the defenders first of all, because we're on their side. And we'll go through the Easterlings first, and obviously there will be a timestamp in the description below if you're not interested in the army compositions, but I would recommend you stick around, because Silmarillion is of course a little bit newer than something like Reforged, where everyone kind of knows the units and the like, especially with newer factions like the Easterlings here. It's obviously going to be a little bit different. So, actually I've got to change this. Like, I don't normally have these banners active, and I think I will have to go back and change that, because I don't really like them active on the field. It's a little bit too cluttered for my liking, but we'll make do for now. So we have the Wardens of Lothland. So here we have a unit of spear infantry. The Easterlings, I have noticed, have got some pretty interesting tools available to them, but we'll go through that. I mean, the Wardens of Lothland obviously just more sort of basic unit for them, as are the Clan Guard of Lothland. Obviously they are a line infantry unit. We'll see how well they stack up against the other offerings from other factions. That will obviously be the best indicator of their quality. Similar story with the Wardens, I would suppose. But yeah, mixed front line this from Tundra's Fox, as he interlinks his spears and his swordsmen of a more basic variety on the front. Just in behind we have the Marauders of Heimring. So this is a unit of axe line infantry. So they're obviously going to be a little bit more focused around their attack. Easterlings in general are going to have quite a few units that are capable of dishing out quite a bit of damage, and the Marauders should add that to the front line. And just in behind we have some Eastron Marauders. Now it'll be interesting to see. They are an axe throwing unit, I do believe. So yeah, obviously a unit of axe throwers like this, they are very, very damaging against the right kinds of units. Shields, you know, and armoured units can mitigate the damage somewhat, but they can be really, really savage, especially against unshielded spear infantry. So two-handed spears, pikes, halberds, that sort of thing. They can be really, really good at dealing with those kinds of units. So all of a sudden, the fact that the House of Finarfin have pikes and the Realm of Angband have got halberdiers, suddenly there's another kind of unit which is effectively a hard counter against them, as long as you can get them into throwing range, because obviously they are going to be very easy to deal with. With archers, you only have to look at them to see that they're not the most heavily armoured. Just in behind we have the Ravagers of Heimring. Now, the Falks is a unit which the Easterlings make a pretty liberal use of. There's quite a few Falksmen in the Easterling roster, so they are a very good unit of shock infantry. There are some subtleties to them, but we won't be going into that too much here, mainly because I don't know the actual numbers behind it. But as with most shock infantry, they're going to have a huge amount of damage, especially on the charge. It's even greater than other types of shock infantry. And also, you know, they're going to be good in sustained melee against mounted units, as most forms of this kind of shock infantry are. The Ravagers, I believe the Ravagers are the stronger of the two shock infantry units, of the basic shock infantry anyway. I mean, if we have a look back here, well, actually that's less, no, I'd say this one is actually the more elite unit. It's kind of difficult to tell actually. Both these sets of armour look pretty decent actually. Pillagers of Heimring though, once again you can see the Falcons. The Falcons on these guys looks a little bit more ornate, so I'd actually be maybe a little bit more inclined to believe, yeah, and they've got less man in the units, so that's a real dead giveaway that they are the stronger of the two. Obviously with shock infantry like this though, you do need to be very, very careful because it does leave you pretty vulnerable to missiles, especially if you're on the defence like this on an open hill. They can be focused down, and I would imagine that's what the attackers are going to be trying to do here. And then at the back we have the Sons of ULFANG, which are of course a top tier bodyguard unit. They have a serrated Falx, which is pretty nasty looking. So yeah, obviously a really strong unit of damage dealing infantry this. If you can get them in and amongst things, they're going to do a ton of damage to most anything they fight really. It's only going to be against the very best infantry that is of a type that they aren't very good at fighting. They're going to start to struggle a little bit, so lightly armoured, highly skillful units would be the sort of thing that I would imagine the Sons of ULFANG might struggle a little bit against, but even so, lots of damage, good buffer on the front line here of shielded infantry, and they've got some axos as well. No archers that I can see, but they may be hidden in the trees because they're fairly close to it. Then we have J-Monster himself, who sent me this, so big thank you to him, and he is going to be playing as Doriath, as he often does. Doriath is the one that is the faction that I've seen him play the most of in the game up till now. He's got 2 units actually of the Donath and Mablung, which is a big investment. It does go to show, I think, that the Easterlings most definitely have actually some units over here. So Salamandrian Guard, which I missed out, so we'll delay Doriath for the time being. Salamandrian Guard are a unit of horse archers that I believe are a bodyguard tier horse archer unit that are incredibly powerful in melee and at range. I think they actually had to be toned down a little bit in the testing process because they were so powerful in melee that they were kind of really, really difficult to deal with. I would imagine they're very expensive as a result of that as well. I haven't actually looked at the relative pricing of the Easterlings because I haven't seen them up till now. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see how a unit of horse archers works there. On the more open terrain, actually, they should be very, very useful. But J-Monster has also gone for a double dip on one of his bodyguard units, and the Donath and Mablung were obviously really, really powerful, heavily armoured, armour-piercing, shock infantry with those big great maces. The Fists of Mablung, as their name says. Warriors of Rhegion. So again, shock infantry is something that both the Easterlings and Doriath do really, really well, which means they're going to be capable of dishing out an incredible amount of punishment in melee. Whether they will have the staying power over the long haul remains to be seen. It's a short battle though in terms of frame, so I'd imagine it's either going to go one way or the other based on how much damage the defenders can actually do in melee. Not to say that all of their units are shock infantry, of course. Sword Host of Rhegion are a unit of very high quality line infantry as well. Their armour is not quite up to the same level as someone like Fëanor. But having said that, still very, very strong in melee. Good melee defense on account of their swords. And he's also gone for some Rangers of the Girdle. So some detachments of them, some half-strength units. The Rangers of the Girdle, it's worth mentioning, are not Rangers in the sense they have body piercing. At least I don't believe that's the case. Body piercing is something that only one unit in the game at the moment has, and that is from Ossiriand. I believe they're the poison arrow variant of Doriath's archers, if I'm not mistaken. It's possible. Got another unit of cavalry, the Mounted Company of Rhegion, which will do well actually to ride with the Salamandrian Guard, because obviously they're a very nice unit of melee cavalry to block an initial charge from enemy cav and allow the horse archers to continue to do their thing. Lots of shield bearers of Rhegion, which will be very good at holding a front line, because of course that's going to be very necessary considering the exposed nature of the hill. They're going to need to spread their line a little bit more thinly, and you're going to need good units in order to rely on in order to be able to do that effectively. Axemen of the Girdle, so this I believe is a throwing axe unit. You can see that they carry a lot of axes. It looks a little bit interesting there behind the shield. But once again, as soon as the attackers close in, those axes should be used to very good effect. Some Axe Guard of Rhegion, a slightly more attack-orientated line infantry unit in comparison to the Sword Host, and a Catapult as well, with the Catapult crew obviously, which are very capable of defending themselves. So a good mix here of attacking and defensive units. So it'll be interesting to see how the defenders decide to play this really. On the attack, it's not a themed battle by the way, this is more just of a nice battle to sort of showcase Silmarillion and some of the things that they've added, including the vegetation and some of the new things like the Easterlings. We have Revan of Korriban, who's going to be playing as Angband. So something like the Iron Shot Halberdiers, if they get into a melee fight and get their phalanx down, they're going to be effective, but based on the amount of axe throws that are on display today, they may struggle. They're decently armoured, but without a shield, those axe throws are going to be able to wreak havoc upon their lines. Ironshod Legionnaires, they're going to need numbers here to storm the hill and find those gaps. If they can do that, the defenders are going to be in trouble, to be honest with you. And considering the brute strength that Angband can come forward with, they're the ideal ones to be in the vanguard, really. And then their 2 compatriots can be the final blow to the defenders if they play things right. Spear Guard of the Iron Crown, really heavily armoured spears, of course, very difficult to wear down. But against the shock infantry they're going to be fighting, they may not actually be as tanky as they would normally be against the kind of compositions you're likely to see. Ironshod Arbalists, if they can get into range, obviously they're going to be really, really effective with those bolts. The Arbalest, no, not the Arbalest, the Mangonel, that should be really effective again because the hill is quite exposed, so the Mangonel can really do some damage. Guardians of the Iron Crown, armor piercing maybe not quite as useful against Doriath and the Easterlings as it would be against another Angband faction or even someone like Fëanor with those maces. Doriath and the Easterlings do have some armoured units, but not quite to the same extent. Ironshod Ravagers with the armor piercing, again, shock infantry. They're outclassed in terms of shock infantry today though, Angband. And Ironshod Reavers, which are a slightly more attack-orientated line infantry. Similar dynamic between them and the Legionnaires as it is with the Axe Guard and Sword Guard of Region, albeit at a lower tier. And obviously the Valor-Alcar, the Balrogs, which can obviously be used as a bludgeon to get through the lines should it be required. Over here we have the Elves of Ossiriand, which are an incredibly awkward faction to deal with if they are allowed to dictate how the engagement takes place. Uraki has to, however, be on the attack, which is actually where Ossiriand are at by far their least comfortable for me, because of how lightly armoured their forces are, how reliant they are on skirmishy, more kitey tactics in the ways that you would expect the Wood Elves to be. They're definitely the most Mirkwood-esque of all of the factions within Silmarillion, but this fight doesn't suit them so much, I would say. I mean, the upshot of that is, while they won't particularly like being on the attack, their archers will like targeting all the shock infantry of the Easterlings and Doriath. Finarfin Tower in here, he's got Spear Host of Gellion. The Ents can perform the same role as the Valor-Alcar. We've got the Myfern and Tol Galen here, we can't actually see their name, but there they are, the Mace Infantry of the Elves of Ossiriand. Again, very nice, but the armor piercing, how useful is it really going to be? Spear Host of Rathloriel are in here, lots of Rathloriel units because they're slightly cheaper, and that will be necessary as they move forward because they're going to have less money to play with. Interesting to see how they deal with the Salamandrine Guard as well. And then the final army on display today, we have the House of Finarfin, played by Inarius. He's got some Bridge Wards of Nargothrond on the front line. Like I said, they are really strong in melee because they are the only out-and-out pike unit in the game as it stands. I'd imagine there'll be like 1 or 2 more that are added eventually with other factions, but they're not going to be quite as omnipresent as they are in Reforged, so to have a unit like this is incredibly useful. But axe throwers are an ideal tool to try and bring against them, so we'll see how useful they are. Archers of Talath Dirnin, again, archers on those hills against that shock infantry, going to be incredibly useful. So Marksmen of Nargothrond for the same reason, again. They are the split shot projectiles, I believe. Archers of Talath Dirnin up here on the hill, I mean, they don't have to worry too much about a counter-attack, I don't believe, from Doriath, so they didn't necessarily need to be quite that careful. Back here, the heavily armoured spears, which is where the general is, the Sartor Finderato. As with most things Finarfin, very tough to break down. Again, they are all around the most defensive faction in the game. They actually have less armour than the very highest tier of Fëanor units, actually, but Fëanor, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more of the Obladris about them, where they're a little bit more designed to be on the front foot with their really heavy cavalry and their heavy infantry, whereas Finarfin are definitely more defensive with their polearms, with their spears. Everything about them is more at home when they are the ones sort of reacting to things in much the same way as the Syrian, actually. But here, they have to be on the front foot, they have to be aggressive, and eventually they're going to have to engage in melee against some pretty nasty units of infantry. But without further ado, let's begin. It'll be interesting to see how the new vegetation affects the performance, actually. But yeah, don't worry about the banners. I will be getting rid of them, I believe, as soon as I'm done recording this, actually. Might be worth just writing a little reminder to myself so that I don't forget and leave that to another time, because I don't really like them, to be honest with you. Never been the biggest fan of the banners when you're looking at it from a replay perspective. They are somewhat useful in the game because, of course, when they start flashing, it's a sign that the unit is on the verge of routing, which does mean you can see where your line is weakest and strongest at a glance. But no, not for me. Not from a visual perspective, anyway. Ravagers of Heimerring moving forward. Interesting to see, actually, the the front foot nature of the Easterlings here. They're actually not falling back to the higher sections of the hill where there are trees, where things can get a little bit more chaotic. They are actually moving forwards. And they are going to try here, and I believe try and deal with these two armies as quickly as possible before Finarfin gets over here. Finarfin's army has revealed itself as well, so there's going to be more spears, there's going to be more infantry. There's the Arqueni more Magilwa as well, which are obviously a really strong unit of heavy swords, and one of the few units of out-and-out attacking units that Finarfin have at their disposal. But that's the kind of unit, actually, speaking of which, that would be quite poor for some of the armour-piercing bodyguard units to deal with. Meanwhile, Valor-Alcar, Ents moving over here. Not necessarily the best target for something like the Salamandrian Guard to go after. So they're going to start firing in fire arrows. They have the same projectile of fire arrows as the Nar Rim have. For the Nar Rim, it's entirely cosmetic. For the Salamandrian Guard, I'm actually not entirely sure. It might actually have a morale nerfing defect in the same way that poison arrows do. Just a different cosmetic twist on it, which will be interesting. Firing a few volleys into the Ents, but the Ents are tanky. They may be made of wood, but the Ents are going to be so resilient to arrow fire like that. The Valor-Alcar are also moving up. They need to be a little bit careful, these kinds of units, though. While they can be a really good bludgeon against the Easterlings and Doriath, they've got so much shock infantry at their disposal. Something like the Valor-Alcar and the Ents might not actually be as effective as they would normally be. Salamandrian Guard are retreating into the hills, meanwhile. They've sort of come down onto the plains with their main army here, the blue team, as the Easterlings start to roll forwards just a little bit. As, of course, are the realm of Angband units. The Ironshot Halberdiers leading the way, which is quite interesting. If there are archers on the front line, perfect target for them. As are the Arbalists, to be honest with you. Lots of units that you wouldn't mind going after with some of your archers. Obviously, Ossiriand marching in step with Angband as well. So, very good synergy, actually. Heavy armour and numbers, archers, skill. Most of what you would want is bound up in those two factions there. Pillagers of Heimring moving into the trees as well. Falk's infantry. They're definitely not going to want to charge forward with their Ents and Valor-Alcar alone with all of this shock infantry filtering into the hills. Doriath, I think, is going to try and seize the high ground first and foremost. And I think Angband and Ossiriand are going to start moving up onto this section of high ground as well, so they don't have to go up quite such a steep incline. It's only right, of course, but it does leave their flank exposed if they're not careful to a counter-attack from the Easterlings. And this is going to be a very fast and furious fight. Just the length of the battle gives that away, and you know, the manoeuvring here is quite careful in the early stages, but as soon as the first move is made, everyone is going to have to commit everything all at once, otherwise they're going to find themselves undermanned. Ooh, hello. There's the catapult. Not using the fire ammunition, interestingly enough. They do hit, not a huge amount of damage done to the Ironshot Ravagers, it must be said. But it does give them something to think about. One of them actually manages to get up as well. In come the Easterlings. They are charging forward here. Perhaps while the Syrian elves and the monsters from Angband are still in a transitional phase, trying to get into position. Now is when the blue team want to strike. But they're going uphill. Marauders of Heimring leading the way with the Wardens of Lothlin. This one unit is going to get further ahead. Ironshot Halberdiers, yeah, here come the Axe Throwers now. The Eastron Marauders, actually no archers are nearby to actually give them the business, which is one of the main worries you would have, especially with a Syrian on the field. Yeah, you can see now that some of these units are also getting actually a little bit isolated. We're going to go down to half speed because this is going to be a rather long engagement that we're going to have to try and keep track of. Ironshot Ravagers should actually do pretty well against the Wardens of Lothlin on their own, especially a smaller detachment unit of them like this. Clan Guard of Lothlin are there as well, but Ravagers of Heimring should do a good job. You can see there the catapult also doing its thing, continuing to fire in. The Eastron Marauders maybe don't have a shot at this point. I see what he's doing. He's actually going after the Mangonel now, so yeah, you want standard shot for that. Easterlings have moved in. The Pillagers of Heimring are going to tear their way through the spear host of Galleon that were out of formation when they got pounced upon, and those Falxes are going to do a really good job there. Meanwhile, there's more Easterlings up here as well. Pillagers of Heimring in against the Ents. The Ents are going to get some support from the Mythern and Tol Galen, however, which should be enough, to be honest, to tilt this fight back in the favour of Ossiriand. As good as shock infantry is against the Ents, the Mythern are a very serious unit of infantry. The Randirim are here as well. I mean, a unit of body-piercing projectile archers is something you absolutely want to try and disable if you can. Erfinen Tower, several units of them firing into the lines. Doriath at the moment haven't committed as much of their units as the Syrian. In fact, they've committed basically nothing, so they're going to be sort of the second wave in. I hope that the Easterlings can hold on in these places, or at least make enough gains to make this worthwhile. There's definitely a lot of reserve action going on from the other side as well. More of the spear host of Rathloriel being committed forward, but these Falksmen, to be fair, I think Ossiriand are probably one of the Falksmen won't do quite as well against the Syrian infantry again as they would against the Angband infantry. And over here you can see the Wardens of Lothlan are getting really put down pretty hard by the Iron Shards. And let's not forget, I would back the blue team to win this fight because they are, after all, able to spend more on their armies than the red team are, army to army, and it's 2v2 here at this point. But Finarfin are getting closer all the time. You need to deal with these two armies as quickly as humanly possible. The Mangonel hitting there, centre mass into the Ravagers of Heimring. Over here, these Ironshot Ravagers are going to very quickly find themselves getting destroyed. The Legionnaires are trying to save them. The Valor Alcar are getting in here as well, but it's an interesting choice actually of target for the Valor Alcar. Going after some shock infantry. It might have been worth their while to get in and muck up some of the things back here, because there are still axe throwers that are there for the taking. Meanwhile, Ravagers of Heimring trying to sneak around the sides, but Raven of Korriban is on it. He's got a unit of Spear Guard to block the way. Not a particularly good fight for the Spear Guard 1v1, I don't think. The Ravagers, however, are getting shot as well by Arbalest, which should actually be enough to tilt that fight back in the favour of the red team. So far, I'd say it is at half speed, so we're not seeing a nice hit there. Damage limited, but still. The red team, well, the blue team are now moving forward. Like I say, initially I would say maybe not quite enough committed to the front line, and that may end up costing them. But Doriath are now here in force up on the higher ground, and to be honest with you, Ossiriand don't have the numbers up here on first glance to guard all of these archers. The Salamandrine Guard are also going to be able to get around the flank and start firing in. Poison arrows are coming forth now from the Rangers that Doriath have available to them. Warriors of Region moving forward again. There's a lot of AP in these armies, which is not going to be all that useful against the Syrian, but they need to keep moving forward here. The blue team, they need to carry this momentum forward, otherwise they're going to be in trouble. They decided to take an aggressive stance, which I do like, but they now have a very, very limited amount of time before Finarfin arrives on the scene, and they need to make some serious progress through the lines, maybe up on the hills over there more so than down here, where I think the Easterlings are actually going to have to change their tack and form up some kind of defence against the advancing Finarfin forces, because if they don't, Finarfin are going to be able to roll up the line with Angband here, and the Easterlings are going to be in massive, massive trouble. Clan Guard of Lothlan are struggling. The Ravagers of Heimring. The Valor Alcar are here. They are actually a really good unit for dealing with Valor Alcar and with Iron Shods, because Iron Shods, their main defence comes from their armour, but they're just being overwhelmed here in terms of sheer numbers. While over here, Ravagers, defeat seems certain for them. I mean, the Spear Guard in formation with the support of those crossbows is doing a very good job. One of the Mangonels has fallen by the wayside. Yeah, this front line over here was more sacrificial, I think, looking at it. But I mean, in order for this to pay off, they're going to need to do some damage very quickly up here on the high ground. And they're doing damage, but I don't think it's at the pace it needs to be for Doriath to really gain an advantage. Meanwhile, those Salamandrine Guard firing into the scouts of Gellion, yeah, they're shaken, so I would think actually those fire projectiles and those poison projectiles are having an impact on morale, because they haven't taken that much damage. A charge from the mounted company. They are melee cav, however, so it's not going to be the end of the world. Although it might be enough to break them, we'll see. Erfinen Tower pulling out those axes again. In melee, heavy axemen like this are going to be really good against mounted units. They get put in the dumpster as much as anyone off the charge, heavy axemen. They're good in melee. If you don't have any spears on hand, they definitely make a good stopgap. Meanwhile, over here, a bit unfortunate here for the Easterlings. Their Eastron Marauders have been caught out in melee, but they are firing in. They are firing into the defenders of Talath Din in there. They're going to be able to do some decent damage to them, but how much are they going to be actually going to be able to do? Obviously in melee, they're really not going to be able to do... Ooh, turning their backs there. This is going to be a volley at some stage, and you know, the spears actually tripping over themselves here, so these axes really actually going to be able to do some good damage here to these spears. Finarfin are over here now though. They have got some units in melee with the Eastron Marauders, and it's the Stalkers of Toren Faroth, which actually have taken a lot of losses on the approach to the Eastron Marauders, I should say. Meanwhile, ooh, that there, Marksman of Nargothrond, you can see the split shots coming in. The trail of the projectiles is not quite as pronounced now, but they're going to be doing some damage to the Ravagers of Heimring, which is definitely the kind of target you want to be going after with your shock infantry. Spear host of Rathloriel moving up the hill. Again, I think half speed is still kind of needed here because there's so much going on all across the line. I don't want to miss any of it. We could miss the key engagements after all. Pillagers of Heimring moving forward. I mean, these archers still putting up a good fight, and that's the thing. The Urfinen Tower are really good in melee as well as being effective at range. Scouts of Gellion a little bit less so. They're decent at keeping themselves alive in melee with their dual short swords, but they're not going to last too much. Well, actually, yeah, it's shaken. Poison arrows hitting the backs of their own men, doing some damage. Axemen of the Girdle. They're going to be trying to use their throwing axes. Urfinen Tower would be a pretty good target to go after with them. Forward come the Axe Guard. They are making some genuine progress now with the Doriath and Mablung. Sword host of Region over here as well. I mean, Doriath are overloading this flank. It may not be quite to the extent I think is going to be necessary to bring home the victory. Rangers of the Girdle, Shield Bearers of Region. I mean, here in the middle, Ironshod Reavers losing. Guardians of the Iron Crown, the reserves now being committed. Guardians of the Iron Crown will hold for a long time as well. The Easterlings down here, it's a bit of a mess. Some Doriath units have found their way down here. Some Warriors of Region. And they have technically won in some places. I'd say actually that at this point it's a case of Finarfin taking quite a while. Even at half speed, their units are pretty slowly making their way into the fight. Eastron Marauders just doing what they can. They know they're going to get shanked in melee, so they're just turning around and trying to dump their ammunition into the exposed Ironshod Reavers, trying to get some more of their Eastron Marauders free. Split shots managing to hit the Clan Guard of Lothlin over there. These Eastron Marauders are getting in the way of the Finarfin advance, admittedly, but I mean, it's the sort of unit you should be able to dispose of fairly easily and fairly quickly. Spear Guard of the Iron Crown, victory seems certain. Defeat is a distinct possibility for the Easterlings. Going on here, Ironshod Arbalists. The Mangonel has been trying to fire for quite a while, and if it does get a hit off, here we go. I mean, they get a direct hit on the Shield Bearers of Region. I actually find the sort of showering fiery projectiles at the Mangonel have to be more effective overall, generally speaking, than a direct hit. The direct hit still does some good morale damage, but ultimately it's kind of like a Poundland version of a catapult at that point. For me. Well, Syrian doing what they do best and turning tail and running. That's where they're most at home when they try to get their archers out of harm's way to continue firing until all their ammunition has been expended. And they have been forced back, but I think time is slowly running out here, like I said, for the blue team. They really need to do that, because they have taken damage here on the approach. They really need to start making some genuine progress. I mean, the Salamandrine Guard are in behind the enemy lines at this stage, which, you know, they could do the business. They are getting in and out. But on the approach, those Ironshod Arbalists look to have done some pretty good damage here to the Salamandrine Guard. They're going to charge now into the back of the Guardians of the Iron Crown, trying to hasten the demise of the attacking front line. They are horse archers at the end of the day, though, so I think their effectiveness off the charge is going to be a little bit more limited. And that's not really something that the Mounted Company of Region are going to make up for either. They've got a fairly low charge bonus. They rely almost entirely on their mass to get the job done. They don't have the armour-piercing heft that Lancers have. Meanwhile, now these Lothlin units have held on for a long time, considering the pressure they've been put under. Done a very good job, I have to say. Ultimately, Angband are still doing a good job over here. It's only really the addition of the Ravagers of Heimring and the Catapult Crew. I thought that was Axe Guard for a second there, but it's actually Catapult Crew. Here in the middle, Ironshod Halberdiers have done the business. Shield Bearers here on the front line. Again, they are defeating the Ironshods fairly handily. Haven't seen the Sons of ULFANG at any point in this battle. They've sort of blended in. There they are. I mean, they are a unit which is going to be very, very serious in melee. The Ironshod Reavers don't stand a chance in a similar way, as they won't stand a chance against these guys over here either, the Doriath and Mablung. And you can see now, with some of these really strong units coming in, they're really starting to do some heavy damage to Angband. And this is the problem. I mean, Ossiriand have fallen back. I can see why they've done that, but you know, as soon as they took the Urfinen Tower off the front line, it crumbled for Angband up there. And will they end up paying for that, the attackers? Because I think Ossiriand, even though they want to use their projectiles, they actually probably would have been better off They would still have lost, but they would have inflicted more damage onto the defenders. And then they would have done enough damage, I think, for Finarfin to just come in and wipe them out. Because Finarfin are over here now. They're still taking their time, honestly. You can see there the bridge wards are in position. I mean, it's possible by the late game no one will have any answers to the bridge wards. Those split shot projectiles being fired up into the air, to be honest with you, not all that effectively. Warns of Nargothrond pushing in, the heavy spears, defenders of Talathdin, and the slightly lighter spears. Axemen of the Girdle. A lot of these throwing axes were down here. We've seen quite a lot of their volleys as well actually find their marks. Arqueni, Morma, Gilwa over here, meanwhile, they are at a numbers disadvantage in comparison to the Warriors of Rheggian, but the quality discrepancy is pretty big. Even this unit of Elven infantry is going to be no match for the Knights of the Black Sword, as I believe their name translates to. Arqueni, Morma, Gilwa are, individually speaking, one of the scariest units in Silmarillion at the moment. But they are very limited in terms of their numbers, and they are a little bit isolated. Defenders of Talathdin and coming to support them now. Like, with any really elite unit that's more limited in numbers, they are at their best when they're supported. You can't expect them to do everything all on their lonesome. Hunters of Rathloriel trying to get in the way of the downhill momentum of the Doriath and Mablung and some Warriors of Rheggian. A nice rear charge from the Mounted Company as well. So it's only a matter of time actually before Ossiriand fall apart, I would say. They tried to regroup in behind here, but it didn't end up working out too well for them, I don't think. We shall see how this develops. I mean, here on the front line, Guardians of the Iron Crown. Fighting hard still, but they're kind of on their own at this point against heavier Elven infantry and also the nasty Falksmen. Those are the sons of ULFANG themselves in there as well, so going to do some pretty nasty damage indeed. Sword hosts are actually losing over here though, to be fair. There's not much of them left. The Guardians of the Iron Crown still doing the business. And still some of those Ossiriand archers are doing their thing. Finarfin Tower. I mean, the momentum is with the defenders, I would say, at this point. They have forced the attackers back, and their front line is starting to get sort of bowed pretty heavily. The issue is going to be, do they have enough left to face Finarfin? I mean, Finarfin's army doesn't actually look that big, but there are a lot of problematic units for them to try and deal with. Sartor, Finderato, Bridge Wards of Nargothrond, Arqueni, Morma, Gilwa, all are really, really strong. Will they have the quality left to deal with that? Some sword hosts are getting in the way of the Wardens of Nargothrond and some Bridge Wards over here, but they're obviously going to lose this fight. It's just a case of trying to slow Finarfin down. Axemen of the Girdle, defeat seems certain. Wardens of Nargothrond are in there as well. We've got going on further up the hill, the Ironshore Arbalists fighting in melee against, you know, these Lothland units. They were obviously fighting a losing battle for the Easterlings, but in the end, they're still alive, still doing their thing, still getting in the way. All the while, it's primarily Doriath army up here now, which, considering the somewhat temporary nature of the Easterling army, especially considering the fact that most of their shielded units were actually sent in as the scapegoats for the front line, a lot of their Falksmen as well are going to suffer in the same way that most shock infantry of that kind does, that they're going to have a bit of a shelf life to them. There still are Falksmen up here supporting the Doriath push, as they continue to try and exert some real control. I'm amazed actually that there are Valor Outcasts still alive, considering the amount of Axemen, Falksmen, Macemen that are on the field today. I think the fact that they've decided to go after the Doriath and Mablung is probably going to be the final nail in their coffin, to be honest with you. Only 4 of them remain, and they're a little bit scattered at this point. Spear Guard of the Iron Crown trying to get in there, Mounted Company, Ironshot Arbalists trying to come up, so that's a sign that things are starting to get a little bit desperate, trying to plug the gap, trying to stop that cavalry from moving around with our crossbowmen. They may be out of ammo, but still, I think part of the problem is, like, while they are losing the front line at this point, Ossiriand and Angband up here, they're still getting in the way of the defenders' momentum enough for their ranged units to continue doing damage, which could prove to be a real problem. There goes the Ossiriand general. Saw him, Mr. L'Oreal himself. The ones of Nargothrond starting to move forward. But yeah, I think this is the problem. Like, the Finarfin army is going to be able to move forward, going to be able to do their thing. Let's go back up to 1 speed now. Everything's happening in more or less the same area. Like, Finarfin are slowly making their way up the hill. We can keep track of that. The Orc Mangonels continuing to try and fire actually, but they're having a real issue doing that. Salamandrine Guard are still running around, but they're in limited numbers now, as are the Mounted Company. What sort of unit are they going to charge after here? Scouts of Gallion? and iron shots. There we can see the Hunters of Rathloriel, javelins being utilised to good effect. Fire arrows coming from the Salamandrine Guard up on the hill over there. Very depleted unit, but every little helps at this point. Marks from Nargothrond, this is a bit of a problem. Now that Finarfin are getting their archers in to sort of really shore things up, you're going to be able to do a lot of damage on the approach. And this is where having a lot of your damage being bound up in unshielded infantry is probably going to come back to bite you. Ironshot Halberdiers are surrounded, getting put into a corner pretty heavily. Swordsmen of Talath Dearnin have found their way to the front line, so Finarfin very much a fixture in this battle now, and I think their reinforcements are going to be what tilts this battle irreversibly in favour of what is effectively the attackers, although it didn't really work out that way in the end, to be honest with you. What was the defenders, they've moved into a position and they got onto the hill to a certain extent, but they fought uphill in several places as well, so it was definitely a bold move. In the end though, I think Finarfin is going to be a bridge too far. Sartor Finderato on the front line, I mean that's going to be a unit that's going to take a lot to break down. There's still Valor Alcar in here, they're not going to last much longer, but still getting in the way of things. Ironshot Arbalest routing, to be fair, routing units. Sort of it's a forlorn hope at this point, but Sons of ULFANG fighting on the front line again. These Iron Crown units have been sort of constantly fighting a bit of an uphill battle against the kind of units they were up against, really heavily armour-piercing, damage-dealing infantry, but even with that they've managed to hold the line long enough, I would say, in several places to really earn their stripes in this battle. Archers of Talath Dearnin and Shield Bearers of Region so depleted at this point, and I think at this stage in the battle, even if all else fails, I don't think the defenders are going to have an answer to the bridge wards of Nargothrond. Having pikes in the late game always such a problem if you don't have an answer. Marksmen of Nargothrond pulling out their Elven Curve Blades in melee. Going to be able to do their thing. Orc Mangonel crew. Trying to engage the Mangonel crew in melee, but I mean at this point it is really just we're going to charge forward, see what sort of damage we can cause, what havoc we can wreak. Some host of Ragian back there, but yeah, I think that has been a bit of an issue. Like, archer advantage was heavily, I think, in favour of what is effectively the defenders. Not the defenders, the attackers, I should say, which is a very interesting thing. Like, if you think about it, the Easterlings, no archers were brought to the field today. Doriath, detachments of archers were brought, but nothing else. So it was always in their mind then to be aggressive like that, to use their shock to try and wipe them from the field quickly. It sort of worked to an extent, but as soon as all of these archers got in the back line with no answer to them, it was always a very high risk strategy, and it did, it has kind of worked in all honesty. Like, there's a lot of banners here, and if you just looked at it from afar, you would think, man, Doriath doing alright, but a lot of these units are very depleted at this point. It is a very close battle, to be fair. There's not much of the attackers left. So perhaps with a few tweaks, positioning differently, this could very well have worked. It's not the sort of thing that would work if your opponent was prepared for it, I would say. Because if you know that the defenders are going to be super aggressive, you can build yourself around that. But if you don't know it's coming, it can really catch you off guard. And I think it did, to be fair, but in the end, Finarfin, just a little bit too much. Because, yeah, I mean, Ossiriand and Angband have got basically nothing left. It really is just Finarfin that remain. And Finarfin, I think, are going to be able to grind out the win here, as they often do in the late game, with units like their Bridge Wards. All their Nargothrond units are very, very tanky. And they also have something like the Sartor Finderato in there, who actually match up pretty poorly in a 1v1 fight against the Doriath and Mablung, but at this point the numbers are such that it doesn't really matter. Back here, Orc Mangonel crew, there's one Regian unit, although I think he's routing, indeed he is. Some more units getting in, getting defenders of Talath Dearnin and everything just forming up, everything scattering to the four corners, and that is going to be that. Easterling General finally falls. The Arqueni Morma Gilwa, of all things. Again, the Doriath and Mablung and the Sons of ULFANG, two very, very strong units, but Arqueni as well. And that is it. Not much left, is there? Mostly Finarfin. Few units. The Orc Mangonel crew is still here, and I think there was still one Rathloriel unit battered and bruised from Ossiriand as well. But you can see here the fates of the armies. I mean, the archers did do some damage, but Ossiriand really, like, they tried to get into a good position, they tried to pull back, and it ended up costing them a bit. That attack was clearly something they didn't have enough on the front line initially for, but the problem was, for the defenders, they just weren't able to win convincingly enough against Angband and Ossiriand, and they weren't able to do it quickly enough either. That was always going to be the problem. It was very much a ticking clock for when Finarfin arrived, and if you don't have enough to deal with Finarfin, Finarfin are very good at grinding out results like that. And yeah, an interesting battle to say the least, and it was close in the end, but I think it was always going to be something that would either really work for the defenders, really aggressive, killing the enemy quickly, or it would backfire. I would say it was kind of a mixture of both, because it did kind of do its job. It did really do a lot of damage to Angband and Ossiriand to the point where they were basically gone. And it was up to Finarfin to pick up the pieces, really, but ultimately they did end up losing the battle, so you have to say that in the end it didn't really work out. Yeah, such as it is. Maybe, keeping their axe throwers a little bit safer, a little bit more in terms of killing those phalanx units. They could have done slightly better, but could they have kept them safe for that amount of time, considering the amount of archers they were facing down? Possibly not. So, yeah, it is what it is. Well played by all the players, though. I mean, these are players, obviously, that play on the regular, definitely know what they're doing, so it's definitely what you would expect. So let's see what did the damage for Doriath. I would say that the Easterlings definitely more so were sort of more of a meat shield. They definitely had their Falksmen, which chipped in with the damage as well as their Salamandrine Guard, but a lot of their more basic units weren't obviously going to get up to the same level of kills as Doriath were, as they came in the second wave to try and sweep the attackers off of that hill. But let's see what did the damage for Doriath. Donath and Mablung, for a bodyguard tier unit, it's probably about what you'd expect in this situation, to be honest with you. Very, very damaging. Considering as well that Ossiriand, not necessarily the kind of units that the heavily armor-piercing infantry is going to be really useful against, they did pretty well. And especially against, obviously, the Angband units, that's exactly where they're going to be really, really potent. Warriors of Region, again, did okay. Slightly lesser extent than the Donath, but again, the same things apply. Sword Host, again, mixed fortunes depending on where they were deployed. The ones that were deployed as a meat shield, obviously, got overwhelmed. The ones that weren't did well over the long haul. Mounted Company were charging around in the backlines to really good effect, actually. It's not the sort of role that they're intended for, really. They are melee cavalry with a very low charge bonus, but considering there wasn't much stopping them, did very well there, I would say. As did the Salamandrine Guard, I would imagine, but we won't be able to see the Easterling kills, unfortunately. Shield Bearers, again, holding the line. One did better than the other two. Axemen of the Girdle did okay. Axe Guard of Region, again, in the similar way as the Sword Host. One of them that wasn't deployed in a disadvantageous situation did very well. The other one still did alright, to be fair. 91 kills is okay, considering they were probably put into they were the ones probably put into the worst of the two situations. And the Catapult, 77 kills, considering they weren't using the flaming shot. They destroyed one of the mangonels. It's a pretty decent return, to be fair. You can't really allow the mangonel to run roughshod over you. So even though it may not have paid for itself in terms of kills, they at least had some sort of response to the attacking artillery. But yeah, definitely an interesting battle to behold. Nice to see the new vegetation. Didn't have any performance impacts whatsoever as well, so that's very, very nice. Also nice to see the Easterlings in action. I would say that's a very aggressive Easterling army in terms of infantry. They do have some other things they can do. Salamandrine Guard, however, nice. I like the Falksmen. Both they and Doriath are good in the same ways in many ways, like damage-dealing shock infantry. I've said before that in terms of when you pick a faction pairing, you often want to offset one another's weaknesses in many ways, which is why Angband and Ossiriand, ironically, I think do work very nicely together. Whereas I think if you have two factions that do the same thing well together, it can be a little bit more difficult. You can really focus on that thing, which is clearly what they tried to do here. But especially when it's as risk-rewardy as heavily shock infantry, it's always going to be, it's always going to be a bit tricky, I think. Definitely, in terms of difficulty, it can definitely work. It's not as if it's a completely, a no-go area, as it were. You can definitely make it work, but the difficulty of doing it is hard. It's almost like playing as Ossiriand with their archers, where you can dictate the pace of the battle, is playing on easy. Trying to charge forward with a lot of shock infantry when you're playing as Doriath is doing it on hard. That's where I would. That's the best analogy that I can come up with, really, when I talk about that. But yeah, nice to see some Silmarillion. This is the first Silmarillion replay and standard video that I've done in a while. Having said that, I could have already done a stream, to be honest with you, by the time this one comes out. It's very possible. In which case, it's not the first Silmarillion thing that I've done in a while, but it will at least be the first sort of dedicated video that I've released of it. Anyways, so yeah. Regardless, this is, you know, it's nice to see Silmarillion. It's nice to have a little bit of freshness throughout things, because even though it is obviously still Medieval 2, still Lord of the Rings, it definitely gives me a much needed break, I think, from Reforged. Sometimes Reforged can definitely, you don't want to overdo Reforged, I think. That's what I'm sort of learning at this stage. I will always do Reforged, of course, but I think I need to do some more Silmarillion as well to mix in there to give some variety, because it's definitely much needed, I think, because I am a little bit one note in the content that I produce at this stage. But regardless, again, all of this can be gone through in the channel update, which has gained more and more topics as time has gone on. I don't want it to become too much of a monstrous video, but yeah, I think following on from this video will probably be where I do my channel update, just so that news doesn't accumulate too much. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.